Should I start again? Okay, good morning. We'd like to get started. If you think you're in the session of Taxing History, 150 years of revolts and results, you're correct. You should be here. That's what this session is. I'm Diane Cummins, the Chief Deputy Director for Budgets for the State Department of Finance, a place where I must admit I've been since before Proposition 13 passed. So I have seen the results of that particular tax revolt up close and personal. Sometimes it seems a little too personal, a little too up close. But we have had to live with the results of that vote and a bunch of subsequent votes that have happened to implement Proposition 13. Did you know that if Proposition 13 had not passed, Californians would be paying a little over $30 billion more in property tax than they are now? That's assuming no other changes, which is probably not a very good assumption. It's unlikely that people would want to pay that much in property tax. If there are two things that are certain in life, death and taxes, then there's another certain thing that's equally as certain, that the amount of taxes paid to government is very controversial and people resent paying them. We found that there are more good quotes about taxes than anything else that government is involved in. And this country, not just California, has a rich history of tax revolts. Remember the tea that was poured in Boston Harbor. We didn't like anyone telling us what to do, and we didn't like paying those people money, the people who were telling us what to do. We didn't want to pay them money. Does that sound familiar? It sounds exactly what the complaint is today. Well, we have a very distinguished panel here to talk about the history of tax revolts and related issues. And I'll introduce them in the order in which they're going to speak. First, Jackson Putnam, Professor Emeritus from CSU Fullerton, will be speaking on the historical context of Proposition 13. Al Socolow, who is a public policy specialist from the University of California at Davis, will be speaking on national trends and local control. Then Terry Sexton, a professor of economics from California State University, Sacramento, will be speaking on the property tax structure. And then Fred Silva, who's from the Public Policy Institute of California, will be speaking on the history of state and local relations, emphasizing counties. Each panelist will have 10 to 15 minutes to speak. I have my watch, just like every other moderator, to time them. And then we'll have time for questions from the audience at the end. So with that, we'll begin with the historical context of Proposition 13.
Thank you. As a historian, I told Diane I'm going to resist the temptation to trace this back to the decline of the medieval monarchy, or not even the Boston Tea Party enters my domain of questioning. I'm giving a historical context of just 20 years. We have a 40-year anniversary as well as a 20-year anniversary. The 40th year going back to 1958, many of you will recall, is the year that the Republicans made their big push that seemed to end in a great debacle. That was Senator Nolan's bid for the governorship, the famous musical chairs contest and so forth, which is characteristically written off as a terrible Republican defeat. This, I think, is a misplaced interpretation. The great right-wing push that the Republicans made in 1958, I think, was really the entering wedge, the beginning of what culminated in 1978. I think is a great successful movement on the part of the Republicans to very substantially shift the center of gravity of the Republican Party sharply to the right and convert it into, largely speaking, a right-wing organization. Rather than being demoralized by Nola's defeat, it was simply a strongly energizing impulse, I think, which ultimately proved spectacularly successful. I take as my text here a new book that's just hot off the press. A man named Kurt Schapara, who's in the audience here. A book just coming into print entitled The Triumph of the Right. Is that correct, Kurt? Do you want to give the full title to it?
Triumph of the Right, Rise of the California Conservatives in 1945-1966. So I stopped short of Prop 13.
Yes, correct. Yes, I take that as a takeoff point. But Kurt shows, I think, very clearly in his book that the right-wing Republicans, undeterred by the election results, immediately moved to rebuild the Republican Party sharply to the right. They secured the control of the volunteer organizations rather quickly. The Young Republicans, the CRA, enlisted the support of far-right organizations like the John Birch Society successfully. They broke with Nixon, or Nixon broke with them, which was really remarkably symbolic that they regard Nixon as in effect, too liberal for them. At the same time, they were managing to keep peace in the party with the famous Parkinson's Law, where the Republicans really had coalesced and got spectacular unity. In 1964, you recall, I suppose, another debacle like the Goldwater Crusade was no such thing as far as California was concerned. They successfully secured the victory of Goldwater in California, that is his nomination. And even though the end result of that 64 election seemed bad for the National Republican Party, it was really quite good for the state Republican Party. George Murphy, recall, was elected to the United States Senate, which not only typified Republicans' right-wing unity, but the Democratic disarray that was already beginning to take place. That battle in the Republican Party over who was to get the nomination between Pierre Salinger and Alan Cranston typified this disunity, while the Republicans were gaining great unity. All of this, to a certain extent, seemed to make the victory of Reagan in 1966, where Kurt's book stops, more or less of a foregone conclusion. And supposedly one could see just a continuing sequence of events from 66 to 78, the great, I think, right-wing triumph in Jarvis Gann. But that won't quite work. I think a moment's reflection would indicate that if Reagan is elected in 66, why does it take him 12 years to reach this great culminating event? There's much else that's going on, of course, during and after the 66 election. Of course, the really big thing that caught everyone's attention was not this Republican shadow movement, but the great supposed triumph of the Democrats. Under Pat Brown and responsible liberalism, remember, the Republicans seized the ball and ran with it. Pat Brown, his great legislative triumphs, tax increases, and the new water plan, and a breakthrough in race relations, FEPC, and culminating in the Rumford Act. The Higher Education Act as a master plan act, a landmark bit of legislation, substantial government reorganization of the executive branch. All this redounded to the great liberal success under Pat Brown's aegis. Simultaneously, to remember, there's another key player in that great Democratic resurgence, Jess Unruh, who in many ways was Brown's right-hand man in securing passage of all of the legislation that I mentioned before, as well as getting a significant amount of legislation passed under his own imprimatur. But Unruh's influence and significance goes far beyond this, I think. I would attribute to him his successful effort to keep the Democratic Party not only liberal but pragmatically liberal. I draw a strong distinction between liberal politics and between pragmatic politics and ideological politics. I don't want to go into philosophical, abstruse philosophical distinctions, but I think it's quite plain that the Republicans are with this right-wing triumph are a strongly ideological party, and the Democrats and liberals in general in California had always been strongly in favor of pragmatic, incremental adaptations to reality rather than a strong ideological bent. Unruh, I think, fought the good fight against the California Democratic Council, which in very real sense, I think, look at it in acutely, the CDC, I think, represented the ideological thrust within the Democratic Party just as much as the Republicans were moving strongly to the right. Unruh, I unblushingly think, really almost single-handedly helped to preserve the Democratic Party as a pragmatic rather than as an ideological instrument, and made it, I think, a successful practitioner of politics, essentially of moderation, of compromise, while the Republicans were strongly ideologically bent. Unruh also, of course, had other achievements to his remarkable record. He was the first, I think, really the first in California politics to enlist the notorious special interests, the lobbies, and so forth, in behalf of liberal politics. I don't want to go into details, some of which seem to me, to many, to be kind of sleazy, but nevertheless, I think Unruh did successfully enlist the third house, so to speak, the lobbies, in behalf of this liberal agenda that he and Pat Brown were successfully prosecuting. And finally, I think Unruh's his greatest reputation rests on his achievement in simply upgrading the legislature and making it into a national, much admired, professional legislative body. He got a national reputation for doing that, of upgrading the legislature and making it into really a functioning equal part in the California policy making along with the governor. The latter, of course, also set him at odds with Pat Brown, and another part of the kind of minor key is being played in California Democratic politics is the great conflict between Unruh and Brown. Much of it, of course, attributable to the fact that each wanted what only one could have, namely the governorship. Brown wanted to hang on to it, and Jesse wanted to acquire it. But the upgrading of the legislature was also a distinct threat to the governor's preeminent position, and this set them at odds with one another. And I think this is the third major development, so to speak, that's taking place, is Brown versus Unruh, which, combined with the Democratic disarray of the 60s, brought this great Republican thrust rather substantially, seemingly, and quickly to an end. I say seemingly, I think that's not exactly the case. It's worth noting in passing that one of the things that Brown and Unruh divided over was something I think that shows, again, Unruh's prescience. I know I'm making a great hero out of Jesse Unruh, but I think in many ways he has been kind of languished, unappreciated for much of his attainments. Unruh, it's well to note for the record, certainly in this conference, that he's the first to recognize, as a significant California politician, the difficulty with the property tax, and regarding it as a kind of gross injustice. And it was a property tax that made, according to some very sophisticated studies, which Unruh set in motion, it's a property tax that makes California's tax system regressive, not the sales tax, or much more than the sales tax. And he's moving in 65 and 66 to try to push through a radical change in the tax structure, which would shift the burden of taxation from the property tax to sales tax and others that were more progressive, and he failed. And he failed both times at the hands of Brown himself, or Brown, for a whole set of reasons, chose not to adopt that as a policy, part of the Democrats' policy agenda, as did George Miller in the Senate, who was an old enemy of Unruh's anyway, for a largely personal reason. The result is that they went into that 1966 election with turning their backs on property tax reform, and I think this has contributed to their disarray. Then, of course, the Republicans come into power under Ronald Reagan, and all is one for political conservatism, right? Wrong. Quite clearly, one distinguish between the two Ronald Reagans, especially in California politics. You have Ronald Reagan, the ideologue, Ronald Reagan, the rhetorician, which is he fills the air, and certainly the TV screens with right-wing rhetoric, right-wing propaganda, and continues to do so. But his political record, I think, is very much can be regarded as a perpetuation, in many ways, of the democratic, pragmatic political tradition. It sounds at variance with any of your preconceptions, but I think it's really quite true. If you look at the key year, 1967, I think it practically all is revealed there. His first item on his agenda. How am I doing?
3 minutes.
Well, let me just say, he failed to revolutionize fiscal policy. Taxes were raised, not lowered, substantially raised. Budgets continued to increase at a little faster than the rate that they had done under Pat Brown. Budget doubled by the time he went out of office. He not only failed, but really refused to fulfill another campaign promise to repeal that Rumford Act. Instead of repeal, he lost interest in it and played a significant role, I think, in the perpetuation of the Rumford Act. He became much more of a conservationist than his rhetoric would indicate. Quite the contrary. I think by the time he went out of office, he has a strong record in behalf of conservation. The Redwoods Park, the passage of the CEQA of the California Environmental Quality Act, the support of the Coastal Initiative, clearly put him, I think, as far as his record is concerned, but not his rhetoric, in the liberal column. And of course, you'll remember he signed the Bielenson Act into law that gave abortion on demand. Unruh, in some ways, was instrumental in forcing Reagan's hand in these respects. But it's important to note that after Unruh lost the election to Reagan, this pretty much continued. The 1970 election was a triumph for the Democrats, not the Republicans. That is, they regained control of the legislature, and they pretty much took under Bob Moretti, Unruh's successor, continued this pragmatic, moderate, middle-of-the-road tradition. 2 additional tax increases testified to that. The failure of Reagan to get his Proposition 1 passed meant that when they went out of office in 1974, the Democrats came roaring back. Of course, Watergate helped that, and under Jerry Brown, they're in a position to really renovate liberalism. And, of course, they didn't. Who killed liberalism in California? I would argue that Jerry Brown stuck the dagger into the more or less inert body of liberalism more than any other. I'll point to just one example of that. And his rhetorical assault on government itself. The other turned out he was a skinflint governor, right? Those tight budgets, especially at a time when, ironically, the Reagan-Moretti tax reforms were generating huge surpluses in the revenue. They simply built up there and were not spent, giving Jarvis Gann, or the proponents of Proposition 14, a golden opportunity, which they'd failed before under the Watson Initiative, because you could always say, hey, if you reduce property taxes, other taxes are going to have to go up. Not so. If you got this surplus, we can have our cake and eat it too, and under those auspices, I think that's how it passed under the aegis of a Democratic, not a right-wing Republican administration. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we'll go to Al, who's going to talk about national trends and local control.
Thank you, Diane. Can you hear this? Is this on? Is it on now? Okay. Thank you very much. I'm quite intrigued with the title of this panel, A Taxing History, which has a double entendre associated with it. Either we're going to be taxing or the history's taxing. I'm not quite sure which is which. And reminds me of a wonderful Japanese film I saw 4, 5, 6 years ago called A Taxing Woman. which is a story about a tax collector in Japan and also has the double entendre associated with it. In keeping with the spirit and the letter of the panel, I will contribute to the history that Jack has started off with, but I also would like to, if I have some time left near the tail end of this, reserve a few minutes for my favorite proposition-related topic, which is that of local control, and came in for a topic which came in for some discussion at yesterday's session. There is a national perspective to all of this that links California to what other states, or what has happened in other states, and what continues to happen in other states. In effect, we have had a national fundamental change in the character of the property tax over the last 20 to 25 years. California's Proposition 13 is certainly a key, if not the key, stimulus or ingredient in this arena. And this is quite ironic to see California as a trendsetter, as a policy innovator in the area of tax reduction, because the previous reputation of our state, certainly when I came to the state in the mid-60s, starting in World War II, in the post-World War II area, was that of a policy innovator, trendsetter in the expansion of government. Other states looked to us in the 50s and the 60s for our infrastructure, our higher education system, our water plan, and now we turn around in the late 60s, and instead of continuing to innovate in the expansion of government, we begin innovating in what seems to be the contraction of government. We're still an innovator in that sense, but I think some of our reputation has dropped off in recent years, given what other states are doing in the policy service delivery area. 13 certainly had fairly immediate effects on other states. Within 6 months of the June 1978 election, there were measures on 17 ballots in other states, which is most of the, at that time was most of the 24 states that had the initiative process. Presumably, all of these, or most of these, were on the November ballots, which meant that anti-tax groups had to take very quick action in the few months right after June of '78 in order to get their measures qualified, and of those 17, 12 were enacted. From the 1970s through 1995, 42 states, including California, adopted at least 68 different property tax cutting measures. Not all on the ballot, of course, many through legislative, conventional legislation. The property tax limits on local government is not a new phenomenon by any means. We go back to the 19th century and we find virtually all states had certain constraints on the local administration of the property tax. There were constraints on the tax rate, rather loose constraints, I must say. And this is implicit in the nature of the state-local relationship, the fact that, of course, local governments are essentially creatures of their states. What is new to the post-1970s tax revolution, property tax revolution, are several things. Number one, the volume of activity in so many states in such a short period of time. Within 3.5 years of our adoption of Proposition 13, 19 other states had adopted their property tax measures, and it continues today. The use of the initiative, the use of direct democracy to adopt property tax limitations became a fairly widespread and a new device at that time. The fact that property tax cutting in many states became part of a larger, more comprehensive tax and spending limitation movement more frequently in the past 10 to 15 years than in the earlier stages of this period since the 1970s. What people call TELs, tax and expenditure limitations, have been adopted by 12 states for both state and local governments, another 19 states just for the state governments, and I guess California would fit into the first category because we followed up Proposition 13 a short while later with Proposition 9, which limits spending on the spending category. But the most significant development in the past 20 to 25 years has been the rigidity or the severity of these property tax limitations. Much more severe than the older restrictions, the older state caps. Now, many of the older caps that dealt with limiting the tax rate, that is the dollars and cents per value of assessed valuation, the rate that's set by the local government bodies here. Most of the old limitations here merely capped the property tax rate with provisions for voter override. That's important to consider. And these were not, in many cases, terribly effective in holding down the property tax yield, in holding down the property tax bills which taxpayers receive, simply because they ignored the other side of the equation, the assessed valuation, what the assessors and the property market was doing. So in many states, and California was a prime example of this in the earlier 60s, while the rates were somehow limited, they were capped by legislation, subject to voter overrides. The assessed valuation, because of the booming market and the more professional practices of assessors, was moving up. And so we had all this run-up to the Jarvis-Gann movement fed by escalating tax bill. The drafters of Proposition 13 recognized this, as did the drafters of the measures in many other states, and so they replaced the simple caps with two different kinds of measures. Number one was a combination of capping the tax rate with capping the assessed valuation increase from year to year, as we have under Proposition 13, the 1% and the 2%. The other version of this, more common, found in greater states, was to ignore the rate and ignore the assessed valuation cap, but put a limitation on the yearly increase of the property tax yield from year to year, the levy, as it's called. And typically, these are capped at either the rate of inflation, the CPI, or some other arbitrary fixed percentage, anywhere from 2.5 to 5% is the common limitation here. In addition, a lot of these measures limited the ability of voters to override whatever caps there were. California's property tax restriction is still just about the most severe of any states, but there are two other western states that come very close to us, in fact, in some respects may exceed us, and these are Montana and Oregon, which followed California's experience with their own initiatives a bit later on. And in common, all three states have limited voter override, 2/3 requirements, or no voter ride possibility whatsoever, such as we have in California for the operational use of the property tax. We do have, because of a later change after Proposition 13, the ability to use the property tax to pay off geo debt, but that also requires a 2/3 voter requirement. And they also feature rollbacks at the time of their institution, of their time of their enactment, provisions rolling back the assessed valuation several years before the enactment itself. The anti-property tax movement is very much alive and kicking today. One aspect of this is the fact that it has become institutionalized, particularly in those states that have the initiative process. Daniel Smith, who is a fellow political scientist, it's a plug for the profession, has a wonderful book just published called Tax Crusaders and the Politics of Direct Democracy, in which he argues several things, that the Jarvis-Gann movement and comparable movements in other states were not true populist movements. He calls it a fake populism or faux populism. In effect, they were highly professional organizations. They continue to exist today. They have developed organizational strength. They are major players in the politics of their respective states. The the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association today is looked to all the time whenever there are issues of taxation. They're in the middle of the fray. They have not only political and campaign expertise, they have a lot of legal expertise. And so one of the products here is to institutionalize the anti-tax movement. The other result of this, I argue in an article that will appear shortly in a journal called Publius, is a centralization and loss of local control that we associated with California's Proposition 13. That has occurred fiscally in many other states, and it's a national trend because of the ways in which we have been restricting the local use of the property tax in recent years. Not all states have this. Certainly, very few states come close to California's restrictiveness, but there's enough here to be able to say this is a national trend. I only have 4.5 minutes. Let me just throw in a few comments about local control, California specific here, referring to Diane's comments about the Boston Tea Party. That really was about local control. I don't think it was about taxation so much. It was about who was doing the taxation, and who was getting the benefits. The most interesting and intriguing aspect of 13 to me has to do with what happens in the context of community governments and politics. What 13 produced is a direct confrontation of two ideologies: local control on the one hand and tax limitation on the other hand. Local control, you may want to call it community self-governance, home rule, which is the legal manifestation, is a traditional value in California as it is in most other states. We generally believe, to use the popular expression here, that the government closest to the people is the best, whatever that means. It's not so much a legal and constitutional principle, because there is no generic statement in the California Constitution that says there is complete local control. You find specific statements: local control in this area, structural, fiscal, service delivery, regulatory, police power, and what have you. It's more important as a political and ideological principle, a sense that this is where things should be decided, not in Sacramento within certain limits, and certainly not in Washington also within certain limits. But I have to say, and I think we would all agree, that in the battle between the two, tax limitation has it won it hands down. Local control, although valued generally by folks, is an abstraction. Tax limitation is an immediate, practical, personal, pocketbook value. Now, these don't have to be directly confronting competing ideologies. In fact, before 13, local control allowed both tax limitation and expansion of government, depending on how the political process worked itself out in every city, county, and school district and special district. With 13, however, we have the statewide electorate telling local electorates we're one and the same. It's a matter of aggregating us to the state level or disaggregating us to the local level, but one electorate telling the other electorate, one hat telling the other hat, that no, you don't have that flexibility anymore to make these fiscal decisions. And two changes, 1 minute, okay. The two key changes here in the fiscal rules that were imposed by 13 is the greater applicability of the two-thirds voter requirement. Incidentally, two-thirds voter requirement we've always had for many, many decades in the case of general obligation debt. What's new here is the wider application to that principle to operational purposes. And most importantly, the limiting the rate on the ad valorem tax to 1% of market value. I cannot overstress the significance of that second restriction, because having control over the rate, given the significance of the property tax, was the key fiscal discretionary authority allowed local representative bodies. It was the thing that allowed them to make decisions. It was the power that allowed citizens to get together, taxpayers, and crowd those chambers at tax rate setting time during the budget process. It engaged people. It involved a lot of messy politics, but a lot of good politics. It meant a very visible, accountable, politically responsible process. We've completely lost that. Nobody cares no longer what happens in the local budget process except the bureaucrats and the public employee unions and occasionally the elected officials if they can figure out how that works. I've got a lot more to say, but my time is slipping away. Thank you, Diane.
Thank you. Now we'll go to Terry, who's going to talk about the property tax structure.
I have some pictures for you this morning and some numbers, so put those up. Yesterday when I was telling my students that I wouldn't be in my office this morning because I'd been invited to participate in this panel discussion on Prop 13, they asked me how I was going to vote on that this fall. And when I explained to them that this was a 20-year-old initiative, they said, well, then who cares? So, I'm glad to see that a lot of people know what Prop 13 is and care this morning. I think what I'll do is try to summarize some of the results from a study that was just completed this year by Steve Sheffrin and myself with the support of the Public Policy Institute of California and some previous research that was published earlier. We did 2 studies. This most recent one, was a follow-up of the first one. A lot of results to talk about. I think what I'll do is focus on one element of the structure of our property tax, and that has to do with the acquisition value basis for assessment. And in particular, the inequities, I call them inequities, you might call them disparities that arise from such a system. The first study, in our first very comprehensive study, let me figure out how to turn this on. We looked at the property tax from its inception in 1978 through the year 1991. And just to give you an idea of what was happening to the price of housing in California, this is for Los Angeles County, and this runs from roughly 1975 through 96. So our first study was looking at the property tax through this period through 1991, and little did we know at the time that we had just hit the peak perfectly in ending this study. Of course, the disparities that arise in an acquisition value-based system, I think, are well known. If you, in 1991, for example, moved into Los Angeles County and bought a home from someone who had owned it since 1975, you would end up paying roughly 5 times as much property tax as they'd been paying. In other words, the assessed value prior to the sale would have been only about 20% of the actual market value of that property. The new owner would pay 5 times as much property taxes as a previous owner. And that's what we mean by disparity. In fact, we measure disparity ratios by taking the ratio of the market value to the assessed value. And we examined properties in about 9 counties in California. And I will focus on our results from Los Angeles because it's the biggest county, representing about 30% of the total property tax base in the state. Plus, it's pretty representative, I think. Okay, what we found in 1991 was that if your property had a 1975 base year, meaning that the last time the property had changed ownership was 1975 or before, for those particular properties we found a median disparity ratio of just over 5. And this is what I was explaining. Property taxes for new purchases of such properties were 5 times what they had been before. So essentially market value is 5 times the assessed value. Now these are listed in descending order of base year, what you can do, of course, is find the year that you purchased your home, and in 1991 then figure out what kind of savings you were getting from Prop 13. For example, we purchased our home in '86, and this says that we were, our market value had already exceeded our assessed value by a factor of 1.66. So every property owner who had purchased property really up through 1991 was saving money under Proposition 13. There was a disparity between assessed value and market value. Okay, and of course the reason for this is that the assessed value is going up at only 2% a year, and market values in California were going up much faster. What we did in this last year then was try to take a look at what's happened since property values have declined. And the decline was, I think, probably much greater in some of the areas of Southern California, as much as 25 or 30%. I think, excuse me, Santa Clara County and some of the Bay Area counties didn't experience nearly the decline that was experienced in Southern California and Los Angeles. So we repeated our study and computed disparity ratios for properties in 1996. And of course, what we saw, because market values had come down, disparity ratios had also declined, meaning that some of this inequity had disappeared. A 1975 base year property, if it was purchased in 1996, would end up with almost 4 times the property tax. Fourfold increase. So down from the slightly over 5 that we found in 1991. And all of the disparity ratios for every class, in other words, every base year of property had declined. And we get down to about 1988, 87, 88 properties. If you purchased your home in one of those years, you probably weren't really saving much at all in terms of property taxes after the real estate recession. So one of the conclusions is that some of the disparities have been reduced. Of course, the biggest disparity still continues to exist on the 1975 base year properties, those that have been held the longest. Another thing we found, and this is kind of a summary table for Los Angeles County, is that the percentage of 1975 base year properties declined significantly between 1991 and 1996. This tells us that in 1991, among single-family residential properties, 43% of those properties in Los Angeles County had these 1975 base years. So they had with the greatest disparity ratios. By 1996, that percentage had declined, meaning that a lot of these properties have been sold off. This is a breakdown. This table also gives us a breakdown by property type. We separated out single-family, owner-occupied, and non-owner-occupied, multifamily, and commercial industrial. And we've made a further breakdown as to whether or not the property was modified. A modified property has a multiple base year, and it was impossible to track precisely how much of the value was associated with each of those multiple base years, so we just put them into 2 different categories. But in every case, we got a decline in disparity ratios. One would say, or argue perhaps, a decrease in the inequities brought about by the acquisition value system. Plus the turnover of properties, the natural turnover, has reduced the importance of that disparity by reducing the class of properties that with the highest disparity ratios. And one last result that I'd like to share with you is that we looked at the distribution of changes that occurred across regions in Los Angeles and found that there was another type of reduction over this period in the disparities. This is by region in Los Angeles, and you'll notice that, for example, Santa Monica County in 1991 had the largest disparity ratio of 7, the median for 75 base year properties, and that reduced or had declined to 4.3 by 1996. So they experienced the largest reduction in disparity. And in fact, you look at Pasadena, another high disparity region in 1991, experienced a greater reduction. So there was an equalization across property value classes as well that we see by looking at this regional data. So not just between properties purchased at different times, but between classes of properties with different values as well. So it looks like the recession is good for, or was good for, restoring some of the equity in property tax. Some people would argue that this is not a problem, and apparently this was part of the topic of discussion yesterday. But it's important to keep in mind that this reduction that we have documented that occurred between 1991 and 1996 is probably already on its way back up. Property values have increased, 10 to 12% in some areas, I think in Sacramento in the last year. So as soon as these property values start climbing up in excess of the 2% that assessments grow at, we'll see these inequities, these disparity ratios rise again. How am I doing time-wise?
We have about 4.5 minutes.
4.5 minutes, okay. We also looked at not just Los Angeles County, but we looked at results. Let me show you some of the results for, I didn't bring them down here with me, we looked at San Mateo County as well, a Bay Area county. And of course, as you might predict, since property values didn't fall as much in San Mateo County, the reduction in disparities wasn't as great. There was still the turnover, the reduction in the number of properties was 75 base years. But again, that whole experience was driven by reduced property values, falling property values, and it was a period since passage of Proposition 13 where we hadn't experienced this in the past. I guess I'm going to stop there and see if there are questions.
Thank you. Now we'll end the panel before the questions from the audience with Fred talking about the history of the state-local relationship with the emphasis on counties.
Thanks, Terry. Thank you, Diane, and thank you all of you for being interested in this topic. The history of the state-local relationship is a tense one and is not new to California, not new to the public debate about the power of government. This tension has existed since 1849 when, not far from here, the Great Bear Flag Rebellion occurred in Sonoma. And this tension has been brought about by a desire by people within communities to control their own activities, and we're going to apply this more to the Prop 13 issue, to be able to levy taxes or fees or whatever charges in order to provide those services that communities had an interest in. Now, this tension existed not so much as we know it in our contemporary period, but in the period between 1849 and the turn of the century, it was relatively heavy and a heavy cloud that held over community formations. Before the turn of the century, in order for a city to form a government, you had to go to the legislature in order to get a statute passed to be formed. So what would happen is a community group, business people and communities would go to the legislature and say, we'd like to form a city, and so a legislator would carry a bill that formed the city. And then usually what would happen is the state would say, well, we'd like you to do some other things, and so in the case of the city of Stockton, which wanted to incorporate, the community of Stockton went to the state legislature and said, would you please incorporate us? And they said, yeah, if you'd give $300,000 to a branch line of the Southern Pacific Railroad, that would be fine. And so the Stockton-Visalia Railroad got another $300,000. Well, as time passes and Los Angeles communities begin to grow around the turn of the century, there's a mild outrage that develops over the amount of control that the state has over local community activities. Groups like the Lincoln Roosevelt League form and other community groups form. We call them today civic entrepreneurs. Before they were reformers. In the 60s, I think they were called radicals. So all of these groups grow around this tension that has developed. Now, this tension exists mainly between the state and cities. It's odd that it doesn't ever, I shouldn't say that, it's odd that it does not focus so much on counties, because counties have since 1849 been viewed as agents of the state. So we've always had this bifurcated system in our local government, that we had cities that had more community power, and that community power movement that occurs around the turn of the century, but it doesn't apply to counties. You scratch your head and say, why doesn't it apply to counties? Partly because not only after 1849, but in the Constitution Convention, the only one we've had in 1879, it tells you something about the fact that we haven't had one since, about what we think about Constitution Conventions. But the 1879 Constitution spent very little time on what to do about counties, because, hey, counties are agents of the state, and the state controls that delivery system that exists with counties. But there was a lot of debate about what to do about cities. So time passes, and the home rule movement begins to pick up. And between that Constitution and 1914, more and more amendments go into the Constitution giving home rule power. And although Al, I think, generally is correct on this notion that it's part of a political tradition, I would submit to you that after 1914, it was a strong legal tradition, one that was held up by the courts up until about 1994, 96. I can't remember which year major home rule power decision was made by the state Supreme Court. But, pardon me? 91. Thank you, 1991. So the whole issue has been, how much control do you vest in communities? And part of that issue is, which I'm going to talk about a little bit, is about the amount of taxing power that resides there, and the ability to levy fees and charges and taxes in order to provide those services. What I'm going to do is look at what I refer to, and many folks have referred to, as own source revenue. What I'm going to try to do is distinguish between own source revenue and other types of revenue that the agency gets to spend. Usually we refer to those as subventions. So what I'd like to do is to put up some charts about that. One of the things that I learned, old policy hacks who like to talk about this stuff, you're invited to work with the Public Policy Institute, and they say, you know, policy hacks, you can't do that. You have to have data. So in order, instead of to keep talking about this without data, they said, you got to have some data in order to talk about this. So what I want to do is to show you some data about the history of own source revenue, and what I'm going to do is look at this tension that has existed over time between the state and cities and counties. I'm going to spend most of the time on counties because that's where the real tension is. Well, what we did was to look at this period of time over a lengthy period. Now, only look at the top and the bottom lines. I knew you guys were going to do that. Look at the top line and the bottom line. The top line, these are proportions. And the proportion of, Joyce, we're going to have to do something about this table. The proportion of revenue is, the top line is city own source revenue. You can see from 1915 to 1995, a large proportion of revenue is own source. Look at the bottom line, which is city own source revenue. You'll notice that it changes with particular points in time. You'll notice it changes when the federal government is interested in local services. Look at the subvention line that goes up in the 60s. There are two reasons for that. I would submit to you that the one reason, there are two reasons. One of them is that the federal government is more and more interested in these activities. The other reason is that Maxine Waters is elected to the state assembly. And that you may think that's a joke, but one of the major, I would submit to you that one of the major changes in the public sector was brought about not just by elections, but by a U.S. Supreme Court decision on dealing with reapportionment, because what it did for California was it urbanized the state legislature, and it did it right there. So you'll see a whole lot more activism for what we would refer to as city kinds of issues than we had seen before. The other part of this, now look at the middle, don't look at the total, look at the middle. The middle line is the county line, the red line being own source revenue, and from the beginning, as a proportion of total revenue, it declines. State's interest in the counties as agents of the state is very active in the 30s for obvious reasons. more and more state money into things like what they described as orphanages and public assistance. We also see for the first time in the late 30s, the state looking at a local tax and deciding it didn't like the local tax. That local tax at the time was the property tax on vehicles because they were considered part of the personal property tax. And so the state said, no, we don't want to do that anymore. So what the state said was, we're going to put up a subvention, and that subvention is called the vehicle license fee, which went in the late 30s, became a general purpose subvention. And I want to remember that here's the state looking at a local tax, repealing the local tax and replacing it with a subvention. And of course the view was that that subvention would be there forever. The next period of time is this period between the 40s and 1978, when the amount of locally controlled, or I'm sorry, the amount of own source revenue from counties stays pretty even with the amount of subventions that are provided by the state. We're going to talk about the composition of those subventions in a bit. But look what happens at Prop 13. At Prop 13, the own source revenue declines radically. The presence of the state increases fairly radically. And the rest of the contemporary history we know. This is the famous property tax shift in 1993-94. And you can see what has occurred in terms of the proportions. This is a chart on proportions of revenue, not the total amount. Now the next chart deals with, and again I'm going to focus here on counties, and it's back to this age-old problem of the presence of subventions over time and the amount of locally controlled revenue or locally levied revenue that counties have. Notice that what the property tax does, the property tax is the blue line. The property tax declines in proportion over time. You'll notice that other types of revenue, fees, licenses, and assessments stay relatively flat, growing in that proportion a little bit, partly because of the decline of others. But look at the sales tax. The reason that the sales tax, which is that bottom line, is so low is that back to the home rule tradition that says communities have power within their boundaries and they express that power by levying taxes and various activities, so that the amount of revenue that a county can gather, even though its activities are countywide, is only in the unincorporated territory. So you ask yourself, geez, Santa Clara County, which has 15 cities, has a huge tax base. Why is the county complaining? Well, its tax base, in fact, first, in this case, with sales tax, is only in the unincorporated area. And if a county like Santa Clara decides that it doesn't want any urbanization in the unincorporated area, then you can bet that the transaction taxes as a proportion of their revenue is going to always be very, very small. So what was important to counties as part of their own source revenue was the property tax. And look what it did over time. It declined. So the question of, back to the state-local relationship, back to this question about counties and their ability to raise revenues for county-wide services have been relatively controlled over time. This table looks at the components of externally restricted revenue, and the idea here is to say, well, of all the subvention stuff that counties get, how much of it do they have that they can use for general purposes? Probably the principal revenue source for counties as a general purpose revenue that could be used for anything at their choice was the vehicle license fee. And the reason I put it in the was category is because this tortured history we've had about the state's view of local taxes. And that is, if the state doesn't like the tax base, they change it and put a subvention in its place, which they did in the 30s with the vehicle license fee. Then they came along in the early 80s and reduced it because the state budget was a problem. Then they come along later and place it in the Constitution as a, quote, secure revenue source, and then of course you know the rest is history, because the state decides it doesn't like it as a tax and then reduces it, committing to put in replacement subvention. So these are externally restricted revenue sources from counties. These are per capita numbers in real dollars. And if I can get them all up there. You'll notice that the per capita numbers for restricted, totally externally restricted revenue has grown over time, has grown more than most for a couple of reasons. One of them, again, because the counties are treated as agents of the state, and the other is that there are things that the legislature is more concerned about doing. So the priorities for countywide services tend to be set by the state. Transportation is an example. Certainly all of the health and human services programs are examples. And then finally, this is a predictable table because it shows that externally restricted revenues, that is a subvention that's given to the county for particular activities, is just like the dollar that's given to the county for its agency responsibility. As we talked earlier, counties act as agents of the state. There is little room within counties for the exercise of local power. And logically, these two lines would follow each other. Whether it's a subvention for transportation or a subvention for any other activities, for libraries, for example, it's just the same to the county as an agency subvention for, say, health and human services. So the point that I want to bring to you with this data and other, I should mention other work that the Public Policy Institute is doing, is to try to look at this balance between the expression of state power and the expression of local power and how local priorities are set. I think as we look to the turn of this century, there are two issues that we wind up having to face. One of them is how much room ought there to be at the local level for local determination. I agree with other commenters about Prop 13. Yes, we have a fixed tax rate. Yes, we're going to keep the fixed tax rate. Yes, we probably have an acquisition-based assessment system. We probably keep that. Yes, we have voter approval requirements for taxes. Friends, we're here. So the question is, what kind of room do you want communities to have within that construct? It isn't as though we're going to go back and change the construct. The one place where arguably there ought to be room, and yesterday was a good example of it, is where two different views about the effects of Prop 13, one shared with us with Peter Schrag and the other with Craig Stubblebine, was that little phrase that's in Section 1 of Article 13A that says that the property tax is to be apportioned according to law. Those four words, it seems to me that that's a place where there can be some agreement. Certainly Joel Fox of the Howard Jarvis Association agrees with that. And everybody else says, yeah, we ought to change that. People go, yeah. Well, so that's part of what this message is about, how much room you want to give communities in order to set their own policy priorities. Did I do it on time?
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's have a round of applause for our panel. Now, you must be intrigued by a number of the comments that you've heard here this morning and a number of the premises, so let's open it up for questions from the audience.
There's an economist named Bill Fischel that is pretty well known in my local finance economist, and he puts forth this theory that he has this article in the National Tax Bureau. Did Serrano versus Priest cause Proposition 13? And this idea of local control and that the property tax, primarily going to school districts, was a kind of a benefit tax that people in school districts could raise their taxes, get additional spending, and people liked property taxes before that. And then you take that away, basically the Supreme Court of California says every district has to spend the same, the support for the property tax goes away, and he has this theoretical argument that that is one of the reasons causing Proposition 13. I go to my students who were around at that time and other people in California, and they say the guy's out west. The reality is that people, that was never discussed among the issues, and that was never in people's minds. What do you think about that? Probably Terry doesn't have to comment on, she knows about it, but historians and other people at the time, is there any merit to that argument? And should we be talking about the watershed event, Serrano versus Priest, as opposed to Proposition 13?
Let me repeat the question for the tape. The question really is, did Serrano versus Priest cause Proposition 13? That's the essence of the question. Fred, do you want to take a shot?
He's all wet. And part of it is you can try to take an activity that was, in this case, a set of court cases that are going on at the same time. If you look at the real world, and I'll use LA County as an example, between January of in 1977 through the spring of 1978, I think any person, academics included, would argue that the assessment role in LA County and Orange County meant everything to the passage of Prop 13. And certainly there are these other factors going on, but I think that the connection between the voters and Prop 13 was directly through their property tax bills. And God love him, our dear friend Alex Pope, who was assessor at the time in LA County, knows this history well, and I'd submit to you that it was the property tax structure that brought us Prop 13, not the disconnect that was existing at the time between taxpayers and their schools.
Anybody else? Al?
Fred, this is on. Fred, I have a slightly different interpretation. I'm going to disagree with you here. It may not be the case that Serrano directly stimulated or produced the vote for 13, but there's an underlying factor here that I think official, who I think you have worked with, gets at, and that's the notion that if you start removing the ability to vary your revenue yield at the local level, you reduce the stake of the citizens in decisions made at that level, and school finance equalization has a result here, and I think there's a little bit of evidence, not much, along the line that suggests that once you get K-12 equalization, which means, among other things, that any excess, so-called on a statewide basis, any excess revenues raised for school purposes in the given district don't accrue to that district. They go into a statewide pool. That's the whole concept of equalization. You send a strong message to taxpayers, look, it doesn't make any difference anymore. The decisions aren't made locally, so why take part locally in those kinds of decisions? And I think there are parallels perhaps in city and county government as well. That's the theory, and it's a compelling theory, and there are pieces of anecdotal evidence here and there that suggest, yes, that's so. It may not have led directly to 13, and it may be the case that Los Angeles, because of its humongous size, is not the best test for this, but I think it plays out in many other communities up and down the state.
Jack?
The kind of data I look at as a kind of a run-of-the-mill historian, I found this is a revelation to me, what you said. It sounds intriguing, but I have no evidence in newspaper accounts at the time, in legislative debates, pronouncements by either Jarvis or Gann, making that kind of sophisticated linkage. I think that's the trouble. It's too sophisticated to show up in the kind of data I read.
Other questions? Yes.
I have a question about the supermajority voter requirements that have not ushered in necessarily by Prop 13, but by follow-on initiatives, and its impact on locals to raise additional money if they want to for schools or transportation or whatever. Do you think there's any possibility to tinker with the supermajority requirement? I've heard talk about the possibility of flip-flopping the two, where a special tax now requires a 2/3 vote, a simple general tax is just a simple majority, whereas special tax requires more accountability. Voters know exactly what they're going to be paying for. Shouldn't that be reversed? What do you think of that idea?
The question is there any possibility of tinkering with the supermajority and essentially flip-flopping the requirements between the vote for a special tax and a general tax? Fred?
Yeah, just a short thought about that. This is a muddled distinction, and unfortunately it was muddled by the state Supreme Court. The purpose of the special tax provision that went into Prop 13, as Craig Stubblebine mentioned yesterday, was the fear on Howard Jarvis's part, which was I think true, that if you lowered the property taxes, then there would be narrowly based taxes applying to particular things. He was an advocate for the LA County Homeowners Association at the time, so he thought, gee, they'll levy a tax on apartments, I'm not homeowners, the Apartment Owners Association. So the special tax was defined by its incidence. In other words, what the tax was. A general tax was generally applied to everybody. And unfortunately, the legislature didn't continue the definition and help it out. So the courts in '82 were stuck with what the heck is this thing? And they turned the distinction on its head. And in two cases arising out of the sales tax levied for transportation, they said, well, it's what you use the money for. And so we now have this on its head distinction that says, well, it's the test is what you use the money for, not the incidence of the tax. And I would submit to you that if we could go back to that and look at the incidence of the tax, that would be something worth talking about. It's very tough. Before Prop 218, you could do it. And I think the Howard Jarvis people were at least interested in talking. They discussed it with the Constitutional Revision Commission about a chance for trying to figure that out. That was at about the time they were starting their initiative with 218, and the rest is history. So before 218, I'd say, yeah, there's a chance, but now I think the chance is gone. It is much tougher because of 218.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I think this is a very good question. I think you have to look at the roots of the 213 requirement itself, and the fact that, again, this is another area where you have two competing ideologies. On the side of the 2/3 voter requirement is a sense that private property is sacred, that taxation is a form of expropriation, of taking of private property, and that needs to be protected. And that argument elevates personal property and the protection of personal property as against taxes, almost to the level of a Fifth Amendment freedom, if you will. The other side, of course, is the majoritarian argument that this is anti-majority control. It produces a lot of very frustrating decisions. I think most of the failures in 2/3 votes these days come in at around 60%. Some are 65 or 66.5%. That's very disheartening. That's very artificial. What are the prospects for changing that? I don't know. I'm not in the loop. I know the governance consensus project has been working on things like this. Fred has worked on this via the Constitutional Revision Commission. My sense is that there's time, we're about at the point where we need a statewide debate on the significance of the and the meaning and the impact of the 2/3 voter requirement, and what room to give is there in this area.
Other questions? Yes.
I wonder if you, Fred mentioned 218, and it's closing off a loophole. I wonder if we come back in 10 or 20 years to have a discussion about the impact of 218, what the nature of that discussion would be and in terms of its impact on local governance. Either or any of the panelists want to comment.
The question is, in 10 or 20 years, will people be back here talking about Proposition 218 and the effect it's had on local government? Fred?
Well, I guess Tim Hodson and the Public Policy Institute would no doubt hold a 10th annual conference on Prop 218. I don't know. That Prop 218 reads more like a statute in terms of the way it works. It's disappointing that it's in the Constitution because so much of it is procedural and ought not to be there. I suspect the public finance types would like that dialogue, and maybe by then we'll have all retired or something. I don't know. I'd hope we do it before that. I'd hope we do it maybe at the 5th year, because by that time, new development will have phased into being old development, because much of new development is paid through these benefit assessments, which now have to be voter approved. So maybe in 5 years is the time that you try to recycle it and see what can be done.
So I think the answer is yes, there'd be someone talking about it. Jack?
Diane, in your introduction, you said this is now a $30 billion tax cut. And Professor Putnam mentioned that some have found the property tax to be regressive. So who are the biggest winners in this $30 billion tax cut? And on the commercial side, at least, have the relative biggest winners changed the landscape of our economic growth in some way? These changes spurred certain kinds of economic growth.
The question is, if this has been a $30 billion tax cut, who benefited, and has it changed the pattern of economic development? And before I say anything, I think anybody on the panel wants to say anything? Go ahead.
As far as, is this working? Is this working? Okay. As far as the winners or losers, we addressed that in our earlier study, but focusing primarily on owners of residential property. And of course, one of the things that we found was that the majority of this 1975 base year property, those people enjoying the biggest tax break were senior citizens. And so they were the big winners. And among income classes, it was lower income individuals. And this is one of the problems if you start talking about changing or shifting back in any way towards a market value-based system again. Who are you going to hurt? You're going to hurt senior citizens and lower income people. They were the big beneficiaries in terms of residential property. And as far as the commercial industrial, we weren't really able to identify. We were able to do it for the residential property because the Franchise Tax Board connected property owners to income tax records for us, anonymously, of course, but we were unable to do that with the commercial or industrial property. In theory, of course, one of the fears is that the inequities, the treatment under the acquisition value-based system punishes newcomers, new businesses to the state, discourages their location here because they're going to come and build facilities or purchase existing facilities and end up paying much higher property taxes than the existing competitors, those that have been here in the state for a long time. So one of the, in theory at least, one would imagine that it would discourage businesses from coming. I can't quote any figures or any hard evidence to support that, though.
I think that's consistent with what we certainly believe at the Department of Finance. We haven't looked at particular data, though it's who's been here and who's new is always the issue. You will recall that most of the discussion, however, even right after Proposition 13, was about having a split roll, not a split roll to give another tax break to business, but to tax them at a greater rate because people thought that they could afford to pay more. They got other benefits and other breaks, and that the real property tax break should be to the homeowners. So, Jack.
You asked about Jess Unruh. Quite clear he was primarily concerned about the homeowner, but he also had expressed some concern about businesses in general, that too high a property tax raised the cost of business and passed on to the consumer, leads to inflation. He was particularly concerned about the business inventory tax, which he thought was inequitable and unfair. How well it turned out, I don't know.
Just to comment on the $13 billion figure, I assume that's cumulative rather than annual.
The present value of the $7 billion is $30 billion.
Oh, the annual
Yeah,
value.
the annual
Okay.
value
That's a big
is
number.
30.
That, of
Yes.
course, is not a net saving because other forms of revenue and taxes have gone up, fees and so forth. And do we have any numbers on what the trade-offs have been?
We haven't. It's just, we looked at it in terms of if people were paying the same property tax that they were paying pre-Prop 13 and no other changes,
Yeah.
the value would be a little over $30 billion.
Would we assume then that local governments would be flush?
I think we assumed something else would have happened in the intermediary.
Is that net of the federal income tax, state and federal income?
Oh, right. No, it's just a
Okay,
gross
just the
number.
aggregate numbers.
Right.
It's just, when we talk about winners,
That's right.
income taxes, both the state and federal went up
That's correct.
because we're reduced to that.
Other questions? Yes.
Throughout the discussion the last couple of days, I've kind of gained a sense that the general consensus is that Prop 13 will not be repealed in any real sense. Yet, there seems to also be this consensus that the loss of local autonomy is a negative. I'm intrigued by Mr. Silva's question, what is the room then for communities from here on out? I'd like to just kind of have your ideas on where do we go from here. given the constraints of Prop 13, will it be possible to shift some of that, some sort of autonomy back to the communities?
The question is if there's a general consensus Prop 13 will not be repealed and the loss of local autonomy is a negative. What do we portend for the future, and is there room for the community getting some local authority and flexibility back?
Let me just comment briefly. I think it's important to distinguish between reforms that move to increase the revenue yield of local governments, and the cities and the counties talk about guaranteed revenue sources, and restoration of local control. You can have the first without the second, and I see a lot more interest in the first than in the second, than true, genuine local control. To get true, genuine local control, you have to give the city councils, the county boards, and I would even talk about the school boards, because I don't know why we still elect school boards, because all they do is set the football schedule, basically. But as far as city councils and county boards of supervisors, in order to give them some local control to carry out the ideal of representative democracy, you have to give them some ability to vary some kind of tax revenue. You don't have it in the sales tax, you don't really have it in the fees or in business taxes. That's what the property tax in the old days used to be. So what I look for here, I'm not terribly hopeful, but what I look for here is a little tweaking of that rate. Perhaps some constitutional amendment that allows, within limits, some increase over the 1% for operating purposes, subject perhaps to voter approval.
Anyone else? One last question.
What did you think of Craig Stolbein's suggestion to move the income tax to the local government?
I think it's terrible.
Yeah, well, the question is, what do you think of Mr. Stubblebein's idea of moving the income tax to the local level? The answer was terrible. Anybody else
Well,
have an answer?
just to, God love him, we had a time, and I didn't mention this earlier, that the state levied the property tax between 1849 and 1910. Most of the state budget was financed by the property tax. They levied a rate, tax rate, and plus they had a poll tax. But after 1910, and between 1910 and about in the late 30s, 33, thank you. After the Riley-Stewart Amendment, they went to broader-based taxes, thinking that, and the income tax came along after Riley-Stewart. They thought, it would be better to have a tax base that was broader, that was a transaction tax. They had corporate taxes since the turn of the century, because the progressives hated businesses. And then they had this income tax, and the idea was that you're taxing not wealth, but income, and you're taxing transactions, and they don't know borders. So if I live in Sacramento and I spend some time working in San Francisco, who's going to get the tax on my income? Well, the state's going to get it, and the state's going to use that as a method for distributing services around the state, and so maybe some places get a little more services than others. But to try to then put the income tax as a situs tax, locally levied, then who's going to levy it for me if I live in Rockland or work in Sacramento? All that. Does Joe Cerna get everything that everybody earns in Sacramento? He might think, hey, that's kind of cool, that's good. Or is it just earned or living here? He'd scratch his head and go, I think it's earned. So again, I think Craig, I appreciate the fact he did that for the debate. That's the kind of debate we ought to have.
Oh, that's a nice segue into saying that it's time for the next panel. So thank you to this panel once again.